You buried me because you were scared I would replace you as wrestling's top star." The words erupted from Goldberg's mouth like an explosion of pure rage. Hulk Hogan stood frozen across the WWE locker room, his trademark confidence shattering under the assault from wrestling's most dominant force. What happened in the next 8 seconds would expose the darkest conspiracy in wrestling history. September 15th, 2003. WWE Locker Room, Phoenix, Arizona. The Talking Stick Resort Arena had just hosted Monday Night Raw. But backstage, a confrontation was brewing that would reveal years of buried resentment about career sabotage, political manipulation, and the price of threatening established legends. Goldberg, the former WCW phenomenon, sat on a bench removing his wrestling gear after another frustrating performance. His massive 6'4" frame radiated the kind of barely contained fury that had made him wrestling's most feared competitor during his legendary 173-match winning streak. But that streak, and the career momentum that came with it, had been systematically destroyed since his arrival in WWE. 20 feet away, Hulk Hogan was holding court with several WWE executives, discussing upcoming storylines and creative directions. His voice carried that familiar authoritative tone, but his comments about protecting the integrity of WWE's main event scene were making Goldberg's blood boil. The key to maintaining WWE's standards, Hogan had said, his voice loud enough for the entire locker room to hear, is being selective about who gets pushed to the top level. Not every wrestler from other companies is ready for WWE's main event spotlight. Some guys were big fish in small ponds, but this is a completely different level of competition. Those words felt like daggers to Goldberg, whose entire WWE experience had been a systematic dismantling of everything that had made him wrestling's most dominant force. The unstoppable monster who had torn through WCW's roster had become just another mid-card performer in WWE. Wrestling success isn't just about winning matches, Hogan continued, addressing his audience with the confidence of someone sharing profound industry wisdom. It's about understanding your place in the larger ecosystem. Some wrestlers think their past accomplishments automatically entitle them to main event positions, but they don't understand how different companies have different hierarchies and expectations. The implications were devastating. Hogan was essentially justifying Goldberg's reduced status in WWE as natural market correction rather than deliberate career sabotage. He was presenting Goldberg's creative burial as business strategy rather than political manipulation. The wrestlers who succeed in WWE long-term, Hogan added, his tone suggesting he was revealing industry secrets, are the ones who accept that previous success doesn't guarantee future positioning, who understand that proving yourself all over again is part of the process of joining a new company. Goldberg's hands, which had been calmly unlacing his boots, slowly clenched into fists that could crush bones. Every word Hogan spoke felt like a justification for the systematic destruction of everything Goldberg had built during his legendary WCW run. The breaking point came when Hogan began discussing the importance of maintaining established hierarchies in WWE's creative structure. Wrestling companies work best when there's clear leadership and everyone understands their role in supporting that leadership. Chaos happens when too many wrestlers think they should be at the top of the card simultaneously. Goldberg could no longer contain his accumulated rage. He stood up from the bench with the explosive power that had made him wrestling's most feared force, his movement causing several nearby wrestlers to instinctively step back. When he spoke, his voice carried the barely controlled fury of a man who had been systematically betrayed. "Hulk," Goldberg said, his voice cutting through the locker room conversations like a blade, "I need to address what you just said about maintaining hierarchies and understanding your place in the ecosystem." Hogan turned toward Goldberg with his practiced diplomatic smile, though it faltered when he saw the intensity burning in Goldberg's eyes. The atmosphere in the locker room shifted immediately from casual post-show conversation to electric tension. "Hey, Bill," Great match tonight, brother. You really showed that WWE style is starting to click for you, Hogan said, his tone carrying the subtle condescension of someone offering encouragement for basic competency rather than recognizing elite performance. The patronizing comment pushed Goldberg past his carefully maintained professional composure. "Don't insult my intelligence, Hulk," Goldberg said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I heard what you said about previous success, not guaranteeing future positioning. About understanding your place in the hierarchy. You were justifying what's been done to my career since I got here." The locker room had gone completely silent. Wrestlers who had been relaxing after the show were now watching with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a potential explosion. This wasn't typical wrestling business conversation. This was about to become a career-defining confrontation. "Bill, I think there might be some misunderstanding," Hogan began, but Goldberg cut him off with a gesture that was surprisingly controlled for someone radiating such intense fury. "No misunderstanding," Goldberg interrupted, his voice now carrying the full weight of 18 months of accumulated frustration. "You've been part of the systematic burial of everything I accomplished in WCW. The streak, the momentum, the credibility, all of it deliberately destroyed to protect WWE's established hierarchy." Goldberg began pacing in the small locker room space, his energy filling the area despite his attempt at controlled movement. "You want to talk about understanding your place? Let me tell you what I understand. I understand that a 173-match winning streak doesn't just disappear by accident. I understand that the most dominant force in wrestling history doesn't become mediocre overnight without deliberate creative sabotage." The accusations were specific enough to be devastating, but broad enough to implicate an entire system of creative decision-making that had systematically diminished Goldberg's impact since his WWE debut. "You want to talk about proving yourself all over again?" Goldberg continued, his voice gaining momentum with each word. "I proved myself by becoming the biggest draw WCW ever had. I proved myself by creating a mystique that made fans believe they were watching something superhuman. And then I came here, and all of that got buried to make sure nobody threatened the established order." Hogan's face was beginning to show strain under the direct personal assault. His hands, which had been resting diplomatically at his sides, were now clenched into fists that suggested he was fighting to maintain his composure. "Bill, you're out of line," Hogan said, his voice carrying a warning tone. "WWE gave you every opportunity to succeed. If things didn't work out the way you expected, that's not about politics. That's about adapting to a different company culture and different expectations." "Different expectations?" Goldberg's voice exploded with barely contained rage. "You mean expectations that nobody should be allowed to be more dominant or more impressive than the established stars. You mean a company culture that systematically destroys anything that threatens the status quo." The personal nature of Goldberg's attack had escalated beyond typical backstage disagreements. This was about conspiracy, about deliberate career destruction, about the difference between fair competition and political manipulation. "You know what really disgusts me about your attitude, Hulk?" Goldberg said, his voice now carrying the full weight of 18 months of professional humiliation. "It's not just that you were part of burying my career. It's that you're sitting here justifying it as business strategy when we both know what really happened." Goldberg stopped pacing and faced Hogan directly, his physical presence making even the spacious locker room feel cramped. "You saw what I was capable of in WCW. You saw the reaction I got, the momentum I had, the way I was changing what people expected from wrestling. And you couldn't handle the possibility that someone might be better at this than Hulk Hogan." The silence that followed was profound. Goldberg had just accused Hulk Hogan of being threatened by superior talent and using political influence to eliminate competition rather than compete fairly. In a locker room full of wrestlers and staff, this was either career suicide or the most courageous truth-telling in wrestling history. You buried me because you were scared I would replace you as wrestling's top star, Goldberg said, delivering his final accusation with absolute conviction. And the worst part is that you've convinced everyone, maybe even yourself, that it was just business when it was really just cowardice. Hulk Hogan stood perfectly still for exactly 8 seconds, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, hurt, and finally a cold determination that anyone familiar with his career would recognize as dangerous. During those 8 seconds, the entire locker room held its breath, waiting to see how wrestling's biggest legend would respond to being called a coward by wrestling's most dominant force. When Hogan finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more authority and controlled power than any shout could have conveyed. Every word was precisely chosen, delivered with the kind of measured intensity that comes from decades of dealing with challenges that most people never face. "Bill," Hogan said, never breaking eye contact despite Goldberg's intimidating physical presence, "you're absolutely right about one thing. I was part of the decision-making process that affected your WWE career. I did have input on creative directions that impacted how you were presented and positioned." The admission stunned everyone within earshot. Hulk Hogan never admitted to having backstage influence over other wrestlers' careers, never acknowledged using political power to affect creative decisions, never confirmed what everyone in wrestling suspected but rarely discussed openly. "But you're wrong about everything else," Hogan continued, his voice growing stronger while remaining completely controlled. "And the fact that you can't see the difference proves that for all your physical dominance and impressive streak, you still don't understand how this business really works." The power dynamic had shifted completely. Hogan was now controlling the conversation, and Goldberg was being forced to listen to a perspective he had never seriously considered. "You think your WCW success should have automatically translated into WWE success," Hogan said. "You think a 173-match winning streak means you deserve to walk into any company and immediately become the top star. But what you don't understand is that success in one environment doesn't guarantee success in another." Hogan gestured around the locker room, where WWE's roster was witnessing an unprecedented exchange about wrestling's power dynamics. "You call it burial. I call it adaptation. UWE isn't WCW. The audience is different, the expectations are different, the roster is different. What worked there doesn't automatically work here." The response was gaining momentum, and Goldberg was beginning to realize he might have underestimated the complexity of what he was challenging. "You want to talk about being scared?" Hogan asked, his voice carrying a slight edge now. "I wasn't scared of you, Bill. I was concerned about you. Concerned that you thought past success exempted you from proving yourself in a new environment." Hogan stepped closer to Goldberg, his confidence growing despite the physical disadvantage. "You call it cowardice. I call it experience. I've seen wrestlers with impressive records from other companies come into WWE thinking they could maintain the same momentum without adapting to different expectations and different competition." The education was continuing, and Goldberg was being forced to examine his own assumptions about what his WCW success should have guaranteed in WWE. "You want to know what the real difference is between us, Bill?" Hogan asked. "You spent 18 months angry about not getting what you thought you deserved based on past accomplishments. I spent 30 years earning continued success by proving my value in different contexts and different eras." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Goldberg had indeed focused heavily on what his WCW streak should have guaranteed rather than on adapting his approach to succeed in WWE's different creative environment. The locker room remained silent for several more seconds as both men processed what had just happened. Finally, Goldberg spoke, his voice much quieter now, almost uncertain. "So you're saying my WCW success didn't matter at all in WWE?" he asked. I'm saying it mattered as a starting point, not as a guarantee. Hogan replied simply, your streak got you noticed, got you signed, got you opportunities. But what you did with those opportunities in WWE's specific context was up to you, not up to your WCW record. The conversation that followed lasted another 25 minutes, with the initial confrontation evolving into something resembling a seminar on wrestling success across different companies and eras. Hogan explained how WWE's creative process differed from WCW's, while Goldberg shared his perspective on how his dominant persona had been systematically undermined. By the end, what had started as a bitter accusation about career burial had become a dialogue about adaptation, expectations, and the challenge of transferring success between different wrestling environments. I owe you an apology, Goldberg said as their exchange wound down. What I said about you being scared and acting out of cowardice was unfair. I can see that the creative decisions weren't about fear, they were about different approaches to building stars. Hogan extended his hand, and they shook with genuine respect, though Goldberg's grip could have crushed bones if he had chosen to apply pressure. And you've reminded me that we could have done a better job helping you understand WWE's creative philosophy instead of expecting you to figure it out through trial and error. The impact of their confrontation was felt throughout WWE's creative structure. Other wrestlers from different companies who learned about the exchange began to understand how adaptation, rather than automatic success transfer, was key to thriving in new environments. The phrase, "you buried me because you were scared," became a reminder within WWE that perceived career sabotage was often really about the challenge of adapting successful personas to different creative contexts and audience expectations. 8 seconds of silence had transformed a potentially career-ending accusation about cowardice into an opportunity for education about the complexity of transferring wrestling success across different companies and eras. The ripple effects of their Phoenix confrontation extended far beyond WWE's locker room culture. Within days, word of the exchange had spread throughout the wrestling industry, sparking intense debates about the challenges wrestlers faced when transitioning between different companies and creative environments. The exchange influenced WWE's approach to signing wrestlers from other companies, with creative teams developing better processes that helped new talent understand WWE's specific expectations and storytelling approaches. The confrontation became a case study in wrestling schools, where instructors taught students about adaptability and understanding that success required continuous evolution rather than reliance on past accomplishments. The Phoenix locker room encounter became legendary within wrestling circles, not as political conspiracy, but as demonstration of how honest communication about creative differences could lead to better outcomes for wrestlers and companies alike.